Thank you so much, Malini, for being here, for introducing me. Um, Malini's PhD thesis on the great Meher Chand, the late 18th century Mughal artist, was my bedside reading for the entire time that I was writing this book. Not many people can claim that, I think. So I'm particularly pleased to have her here with me. I do have a little. It works. So, as Malini was alluding to, this book does cover a lot of different facets of what was happening in the 18th century in India. So I thought I would take you through a little bit of a visual presentation, images, some of the beautiful paintings I came across, and some material which will help bring this to life for you to put it into context, and to just touch upon certain aspects, which of course I have gone into in much greater detail in the book. So primarily the 18th century. What we have inherited in India, because eventually the British did win the war and formed an empire in India, what we have inherited from them is very much their history. It's passed on to us, which we have then internalized. So there are many, many mythologies, many, many stories, many, obfuscated facts forgotten about the 18th century that have been handed on down to us. One of the main ones being that the 18th century in India was simply a time of utter chaos, a time of degeneration amongst the elite, a time where nothing really very much was happening, where the Mughal Empire and the Mughal Emperor were really doing very little apart from just being overcome by a sense of lassitude. The second sort of broad, generalized notion we have is that the British Empire was inevitable. It was bound to happen. They were the ones at the right time, in the right place. They had the right tools for us, and they were always ever going to be an empire. That is also something that was completely untrue. They happened to be there at the right time, yes. They took a few chances, certain things happened, and they learned along the way how to form an empire. So the 18th century is really important as a transition time to see how they picked up on tools that some of the Indian rulers were using, appropriated those tools, and began creating an empire. The idea that there was nothing happening in India in terms of the elite and in terms of politics and finance and culture is also entirely untrue. While it is true that the Mughal emperor at the center was being constantly assailed by invasions, Nadir Shah, Ahmed Shah Abdali from Afghanistan and other places, all the power that lay at the center, all the politics, all the finances, all the culture began to slowly ebb away from Delhi, from where the Mughal emperor was, and instead found new places in which to flourish. So we have the so-called sub-imperial centers, which started responding to all these changes in really creative and innovative ways. So if it was a time in which political and financial power perhaps had begun to weaken, it was instead a time of great cultural efflorescence, and exciting new things were happening in the so-called sub-imperial centers. And this is some of the information that I wanted to share with you. The other point that perhaps the British were here solely to make a claim to India is very untrue also for the sole fact that there was another great player at this time that I wanted to bring to the fore on the lion and the lily, and that is France. So at the beginning of the 18th century, France was very much poised as the bigger, stronger, wealthier nation wanting to make a stake on global politics. Whereas Britain at the same time was a very tiny island, much smaller population compared to France, a much smaller army, and very much isolated from continental politics. So at the beginning, you have France in a very strong position, and right from the beginning of the 18th century, the British and the French clash globally at various centers as they start to make their stake for a global empire. So right from the beginning in the 1740s, at the time of the Austrian War of Succession, what is interesting is that these great global wars that are happening all over the place have immediate and direct repercussions for us here in India. Not here in the British Library, in India. They have immediate repercussions which make no sense for those who do not understand the backstory of these great global clashes that are occurring between Britain and France. And as these wars take place, France changes her ambition, especially after the 7 Years' War, so in which she is defeated, and the global empire is divided along between the British and the French. France decides from now on that she will not stake a territorial claim to empire in India, but will instead aim to stop and hinder the British as much as possible by helping the Indian forces and the Indian rulers who are ready to stand up to the British. So a change happens at around this time. Then we have the American Revolutionary Wars, which are very important both psychologically, because the British, I think it is a moment of real national angst for them to lose their 13 colonies in America. And of course, it is financially ruinous for them. They come under a lot of debt, and that will in turn influence what they do in India, because it is for them an opportunity. India is suddenly discovered as a land of enormous wealth. After Plassey, they realize how much wealth there is to be had in India, and they decide, for example, Governor General Hastings makes it very plain that he will try and make up for the great national debt in Britain by extracting more money from the rulers in India. So we see a very direct connection thereby happening between these global wars on happenings in India, which might not otherwise make a lot of sense if we don't have this picture. So we begin more or less, my story begins at the Battle of Buxar. Now we are more familiar with the Battle of Plassey, that Robert Clive, during which he sets up a puppet emperor, and that is believed to be a very important battle. And it is important because the British, the East India Company, realizes how much wealth there is in India. In fact, there are 75 shiploads of silver that are carried away at the time of Plassey from Calcutta, from Murshidabad, to the EIC headquarters in Calcutta. That is the extent of bullion that they are able to get. And for the first time in the history of the East India Company, silver no longer has to be brought into India to buy the trade goods that they desperately need. For the first time, there's enough silver, enough bullion that they have got from Murshidabad for themselves, and the East India Company has. No longer do they require to import silver from England. So this shows to them the great wealth that they can make. But at the Battle of Buxar of 1764, a few years later, so Shah Alam, the emperor at this time, has realized that he is really beginning to lose power, that all his governors are refusing to obey him. They don't send money back to the center, especially after 1739 and Nadir Shah's invasion. So he decides to mount a challenge to the East India Company, especially to say, you need to start paying taxes, you need to start giving us some of our money, I need to be reinstated as Mughal emperor. So he raises an army, and the primarily the most important, powerful Indian leader to join him is Nawab Shuja-ud-Daula of Awadh, who is the most powerful and the strongest man at this time. So this great Mughal army, because Shuja-ud-Daula has this enormous army, they come to Shah Alam's aid, and they attack the East India Company, and they are defeated. This is the Battle of Buxar, and this is meant to be the first time that a European force defeats the great reputed Mughal army, which is not really true, because Plassey, the French Governor-General, had already done this in the 1740s. Robert Clive had learned from him and taken his lessons to the East India Company. Nonetheless, after the Battle of Buxar, Shuja-ud-Daula Emperor Shah Alam is made to sign over the Diwani to the East India Company, which means from now on, for the first time in the history of the East India Company, they have the right to gather taxes, to gather revenue from the extremely wealthy province of Bengal and Bihar. And this gentleman who is there in the corner, that's a Frenchman who happens to be part of this battle as well. Because after the 1740s, after the French ambition has been put to rest, a lot of the French soldiers and the military men go over to various Indian rulers who are willing to take them on and modernize their army. And the most important one to do that was Shuja-ud-Daula of Awadh. And so this man, JeanBaptiste Jeanti, a French general, enters Shuja-ud-Daula's service in Awadh and helps him at the time of Buxar. So what he helps him do essentially at this time is recover his provinces, recover his territory, because after he is defeated at the battle, he is terribly scared that he will be made to give over his territory to the East India Company, that he will be left without a country to rule. But JeanBaptiste Jeanti convinces the East India Company that they need a man like Shuja-ud-Daula on their side to manage his own territories. They would be far too extended to do it themselves, and in the end, they are able to do so. And behind all of these, intricate negotiations is a woman, because Shuja-ud-Daula has to pay at this time an enormous war indemnity. The East India Company agree to give him back his lands, but they say you will have to pay a huge war indemnity of 50 lakhs rupees. At that time, a lot of money. And while all his allies disappear at this time, his wife comes to him and says, I will pay you your 50 lakhs. And she looks for whatever she has lying around in her dowry, in her trousseau, her jewels. It is said she even removes the nose ring from her nose, and gives him all of her treasure so that he can pay off this enormous war indemnity and recovers his land. And this is something that Bahu Begum will never let Shuja-ud-Daula forget, and she will never let the East India Company forget this as well. She tells Shuja-ud-Daula, from now on, you need to spend every lunchtime with me, you will eat at my house, and if you spend any night away from my palace, you have to pay me a fine. And one imagines that he became a very wealthy man following his many transgressions. But this is the beginning of Bahu Begum's great power, something that has been entirely written out of history. As it is, as happens very often, that women's stories are often forgotten, left to into the background, and we forget the great role that this woman and her mother-in-law, Nawab Begum, played. But this is something that I was able to explore in my book, and we'll talk about it a little bit. So what exactly is Awadh? So today, Awadh does not exist as Awadh. It was 24,000 square miles of very, very fertile land, which went right up to Delhi in the west there. North up till the Himalayas, and down almost up till where the East India Company was, Bengal and Bihar. So it created this so-called, what they called a buffer zone for a long time, between the Mughals at Delhi and the British East India Company in Bengal. So this was the enormous Suba, or region of Awadh, which was ruled by what had now become a hereditary Nawabi. So initially, these governors were meant to be transferred every 3 or 4 years, but because the emperor had become so weak, the Nawabs decided to just make their sons the next Nawab, because the poor emperor at Delhi no longer had the sort of power to be able to transfer people every 3 or 4 years. They also did something else, which was to start keeping all their revenue for themselves, because they no longer really needed to send it to Delhi. They saw that it served no great purpose because the emperor was not able to really stand up to the British. So Nawab Shuja-ud-Daula kept all this money for himself, the enormous resources of Awadh, and used his ambition, his drive, and his knowledge to create something really extraordinary in Awadh. So here we have a painting of Shuja-ud-Daula, because at this time, because of the wealth of Awadh and this territory, a lot of Europeans started coming to the court, as well as Indians, of course, Indian painters, Indian poets, Indian dancers, because the emperor and his court could no longer afford to patronize this sort of art and culture. They were drawn to the centers, to the places where they would be patronized, and one of the main ones was Awadh. But you also see Europeans coming and looking for a way to make a quick buck. They really were convinced that there was a lot of money to be made. Eventually, the Nawab ended up really never paying his debt to these European painters. But they were not to know that, and Tilly Kettle, who was one of the first to come, was probably the one who earned some bit of money. So on the left, you have a very famous painting by him, where what is extraordinary is that you have this Indian ruler who is painted in the full frontal sort of way, which was very rare in India. Those of you who are a little bit familiar with Mughal paintings will know that usually painters like to use the side profile for people. So here we have this extraordinary painting of Shuja-ud-Daula. We see he's meant to have been a very charming man, a man with enormous personality, enormous charisma, a militarily very resourceful man, and someone who culturally was very driven to make something of his state, to be able to really transform it to become a lodestone for culture in India. And of course, in an aside, his mustaches were meant to be the finest in the land. As we can see, his little Persian tippet, if you can see that his turban is edged with a fur border, and he has something called a tippet around his neck, and that is also made of fur, and it is a nod to his Persian ancestry, because his grandfather, Saadat Khan, came from neighboring Persia after they collapsed in 1722 when the Afghans invaded. So they were immigrants from Persia. They brought that culture with them as well, and they liked to show it, especially in their portraits, in the way in which they were portrayed to their people. They liked this little nod to their ancestry as Persian men. On the right, you see an Indian painter copying or getting ideas and inspiration from the oil painting by Tilly Kettle. And this painting and paintings in this genre by Tilly Kettle and a few other painters became very popular at the court, as many European military men and adventurers who were there used these paintings to inspire their Indian painters to create something different from what they were doing. So the Indian painters took on this painting and reinterpreted it, used it to create something entirely new. And that is something that Malini has written about extensively. We have this great genre of late 18th century painting that comes around in India, in part, which it does have, of course, some inspiration from the oil paintings that they were beginning to see in such detail for the first time. Now, a little bit about the cast of characters that we have around this time at the court of the Nawab of Awadh. And it is something, when I went into this book looking at the sort of people that I would be encountering, I had sort of assumed there would be the French following the French king with the French flag, and maybe the British with speaking English, being Protestants, and it was pretty straightforward and simple to make out the two sets of people. But in fact, there's a great overlap. This is an extremely cosmopolitan time. Ideas of loyalty, ideas of notions of what flag you follow, who you're fighting for, is something very different from what we may think today. So whereas we might think of these people as belonging to an Olympic team, following one flag, one religion, one language, they were in fact more like members of an IPL team, following whoever would pay them more. So a lot of these gentlemen have extraordinary lives, very, very unusual lives, where they borrow bits and pieces from different cultures. At the very top, you will recognize Jean-Baptiste Jeanti, who was a French Catholic, French-speaking soldier who joined Nawab Shuja-ud-Daula, served him loyally for 12 years. To his right, you have Claude Martin, who was French, Catholic, French-speaking, so you would think, okay, he would be fighting for the French cause, but not at all. The first opportunity he got, he defected to the British East India Company, despite the fact that they really did not appreciate his broken English, they did not appreciate his excessive guests, they found him very grasping, and they found him a social climber. But he stayed with the British East India Company for his entire career, and then worked with the Nawab Shuja-ud-Daula. So we have Claude Martin. Below him, there's René Madec, who is also a French soldier, but ends up fighting for the Jats at this time. They were another rising force in North India. Below, we have Johann Zoffany, who is the Austro-English painter who lands up, again, like Tilly Kettle, in Awadh, and creates a lot of interesting paintings of the mixed community of Europeans and Indian for the first time, interacting, his conversation pieces. And we are able to learn a lot about the dynamics of these interactions by looking at his paintings. Next to him is Benoit de Boigne, who is from Chambéry, which was at the time an independent duchy. But he comes to India and joins the Marathas, and he forms a very, very successful fighting force for them, and his entire career fights for the Marathas. Above him is this interesting personality called Antoine Paulier, who is from a French family, but he is Protestant. So he sees that the British have the upper hand at this time in India, changes his name to the more anglicized Anthony Paulier, and goes over to the East India Company, while also at the same time keeping spies at the court of the Nawab of Awadh. So he sort of plays all sides at the same time. And in the center, you have, of course, Shuja-ud-Daula, whom I showed to you, and his son, who will be the next Nawab, whom I talk about quite a bit in the book as well. So Jean-Baptiste Jeanti, okay, I'm sorry that the title has been a little erased. Jean-Baptiste Jeanti creates this extraordinary collection of paintings at the court of the Nawab, because what's really fascinating is that in the late 18th century, there are three great collections of art and manuscript, and two of them are patronized by Frenchmen. So one of this is Jean-Baptiste Jeanti, and he patronizes these really magnificent manuscripts, all of which go back to France eventually, but are quite forgotten because by the time he goes back, the French Revolution is in full force, the poor king is in no state to appreciate his paintings, and we forget about them entirely for quite a long time. But here we see he's had a painting commissioned of Shuja-ud-Daula, who is meant to be a very strapping man. He is a man who is physically very virile. He enjoys all the activities that you would associate with an elite man of his stature. He loves hunting, shooting. He's very brave. He loves swimming across the swollen rivers during the monsoon. All these sort of grandiose things. And here we see him shooting at a bobbing pot in the water, which is not very clear here. But this extraordinary collection of paintings comes about at this time. Scholars have now agreed that this is probably one of the very first example of what we would later call company paintings, which are paintings made by Indian artists, but for a European patron. So they have taken in certain elements from European painting as well. So they have toned down the registers of the colors they use, of the sort of materials they use, and of the people and the events that they depict to suit a more European taste. So this is the very first time in the 1760s, way earlier than, say, the 1780s, when some of the British painters, some of the British patronized works that are much more famous than the French ones. Here on the left, you have a painting of what would be called you can generally call them the terrace paintings. They became very popular to form, paintings of this genre, showing Faizabad, which is the first capital of the nawabs in Awadh. And initially, when a lot of European scholars were looking at these paintings, they used to criticize the lack of perfect perspective. Because if you look at this image from top to bottom, there are, in fact, many different infinity points. You can look into the garden where the lady is singing. You can look further back where there's some sort of waterfall. You can look even further back into the river scene. And then even behind that, there is something happening in the far distant that we can't make out too clearly. So they would criticize this genre of painting, saying, why have the Indian painters, why were they not able to master perspective? Why were they not able to show us quite clearly in realistic terms what was happening? But that was never really what interested an Indian painter. And we have scholars like Kavita Singh who have deconstructed this genre of painting to say that, in fact, these paintings are meant to show us the very nature of what is meant as pleasure and danger in a Mughal context. So these are artists who have imbibed the Mughal tradition, because they are often Mughal painters themselves coming from Delhi, or else the sons of Mughal painters who have imbibed those codes of Mughal ideas of aesthetics, of pleasure, of beauty, but they are showing you a new reality. Now it is no longer the Mughal emperor who holds sway. It is no longer Delhi, which is important above everything else. Now we have a new king. Now we have a new power. Now there's Awadh. So everything in the foreground shows Awadh, shows the city of Faizabad in all its beauty, trying to attain to those great Mughal imperial standards of what is aesthetic beauty. So you have these women singing a rag. You have the peacocks dancing. Perhaps you would be listening to the correct rag Megh, while watching this if it's the monsoon. So they are saying, look, we can do this here in Faizabad. Look at these beautiful buildings that we have to celebrate all of this. While in the far background, in the distance, what Kavita Singh showed is that those scenes of war, if you look very closely, they're actually scenes of soldiers marching along, and that is meant to show troublesome Delhi. Delhi with all its fights, all its issues, all its lack of money, which it has tried to pull Awadh into during Bakar, but now they don't want anything to do with that. So you see how many coded meanings and symbolisms one can get from a painting like this. So whereas this painting shows a very idealized notion, a very idealized system of beautiful white terraces, the poet on the right, Mir Taqi Mir, who is also an immigrant from Delhi, a reluctant immigrant from Delhi, writes about Lucknow. Ruined Lucknow has been peopled by owls. it is tough to make yourself at home in such a shambolic place. And there are many poets from Delhi who write about Faizabad and Lucknow in these less than charming and adulatory terms. So what is the truth between the two? Is it an awful place full of broken bricks, as one of them says, or is it, as the painters show, this immaculate place? Something in between, I should think, because in the 1760s, these great buildings were only beginning to be made by Shuja-ud-Daula, and there was definitely at the same time a lot of brick and broken buildings nearby. But it's interesting to have the two perspectives, and as Kavita Singh has said, whereas paintings require a lot of money, a lot of investment, these are expensive materials, so you cannot afford to anger your patron by saying anything critical. The poets could just write out a few lines in a few minutes, cost them nothing to say something highly insulting and then throw it away or leave it by the wayside. Here today, some of these buildings that I've taken a few photos of to show you that this great building of frenzy that Shuja-ud-Daula began was carried out by his son as well, Asaf-ud-Daula, and into the 19th century. And they all have this extremely exuberant pattern of ornamentation on the outsides and even on the insides of their great buildings. You have Bahu Begum's Maqbara, her mausoleum on the left. You have details from the great Imam that Asaf-ud-Daula built, and you can see the same exuberant vegetal forms, flowers, and the fish symbol, which was very symbolic of the nawabs of Awadh. It was an insignia that was granted to them, and you begin to see it in all their buildings. And the difference with Mughal high culture at this time, where those of you who are familiar with it, it is all built in marble with very austere flowers and, inset into the marble. This is something altogether different. This is exuberant. This is creative. And it is because the materials they had was very different. They didn't use marble. They didn't have marble close by. So they used bricks laid over with stucco, which was a very malleable material. They were able to make things that were almost like sculptures. So they created this very exuberant form of decorations, which became very typical of Lucknow and Faizabadi art. And interestingly, you can also see it in their paintings. So if you look at the margins, which are the paintings that go around the main painting, if you look at the border, you can see the same exuberance in the flowers. So on the right is a painting from a Polier album, and on the left are just bits that I wanted to show you from the margins of different paintings from the Polier albums. And there are hundreds and hundreds of such paintings, and they are almost all have different marginal paintings. And you can really see before your eyes this enormous creativity that the painters were involved in, that the architects were involved in, that was really carried over this entire culture of the Nawabs of Awadh at this time. These are a few photographs of the state of the buildings today. Some of them still exist in Faizabad, but in very sadly derelict conditions. You can still see the remainders of some of that ornamentation on the left, on the top. You can see on the right as well, but this is a few years ago, and it is being so forgotten and so ignored that in a few years, I think it will probably fall to the ground. Another aspect of the culture that they created in Awadh at this time was the Shia commemorations. Now, as I was telling you earlier, the Nawabs were from Persia, so they brought their Shia culture with them. They were Shia Muslims. We tend to forget that there was a great diversity of people around at this time. It wasn't just Muslims and Hindus, so even among the Muslims, you had Ismailis, you had Sunnis, you had Shias, you had the Bohras, and they were all different, and they all took in aspects of Indian culture in different ways to create a very visible culture of commemoration in this instance for the Shia commemoration of Muharram. So the commemoration that happens on the 10th day of Muharram is when Imam Hussein is martyred at Karbala, and it takes on a very important significance in India, in which they start carrying out processions like this to mark the day. So they take out these little structures which are called taziyas, and they are meant to show the tombs of Imam Hussein and his companions who die at the Battle of Karbala, and they are taken in this symbolic manner with hundreds of people in the procession, crying, sometimes committing flagellation upon themselves, giving out charity to the watchers, people standing by, and they go in this long procession through the city to immerse the tomb, the taziyas at the end of it, either into water or into a Karbala area if they have it in the city. So this is something that Jean-Baptiste Jeanti again observed happening very early on in Faizabad, and I really wanted to show you how extraordinary this is. We have very little of this sort of information otherwise coming to us about how the Nawabs were beginning to, so they were clearly beginning to imbibe a sense of confidence in who they were, and they were also, through these commemorations, making a challenge both to the Mughal Sunnis at Delhi, but also to the British East India Company, because the British really found Muharram something very difficult to grasp. They didn't understand what was happening. They found it vaguely threatening to the order that they wished to bring into the cities that they wanted to rule. It was a procession, as I was mentioning, that went through the town. It went through all the major structures, the religious structures, through the bylanes, before crossing the city entirely. And the British were not comfortable with this huge retinue of people chanting and walking in this manner. So I feel that these images and the way in which the Nawabs were commemorating their Shia religion was really a challenge both to the Mughals and to the East India Company. And you can see how the people who were making the taziyas, who were making all of the little bits and pieces that went around, the decorations that were used at the great religious structures, were all using Indic systems of divinity, of what was meant to be religious. So you have this beautiful peacock, which is very much part of Indian tradition. So on the left, you have a firework maker making it as part of a fireworks. On the right, you have somebody who has made it as this huge bear to carry this tomb. And here you have in the center, you can see again a peacock image. So the Nawabs were kind of carrying out this, this new culture in a way that imbibed local traditions into it as well, so that all the people, Hindu, Muslims, and otherwise, felt very much part and invested into this culture and would often commemorate it themselves even when they were not Muslims. And similarly, the Nawabs would be also celebrating Holi, Diwali, and all the other festivals, in their own courts as well. And that led to the famous Ganga Jamuna Tehzeeb, the syncretic culture that became a byword for Lucknow later on. Here we have an interesting painting that I wanted to show you, simply because it is not very obvious that behind this painting is the will of a woman. So in 1784, Governor General Hastings, who is shown from the back here, balding with a long rat's tail sort of hairdo, has come to see Asaf-ud-Daula, the son of Shuja-ud-Daula, because he has basically come to apologize to Bahu Begum. Because what he has done, Warren Hastings, was try to raise money by getting the treasure of Bahu Begum, who is now a widow in the 1780s. He wants to get her treasure, which is immeasurable. It is the stuff of legends. And he feels if he can get that money, he can send it back to England because there's such a huge debt for the American wars that we were talking about earlier. But Bahu Begum will not be done so easily. She tells the British East India Company that the only reason that the Nawabs have this territory is because of her treasure. And she is entitled to it. It is hers legally by Muslim law. And she is certainly not going to hand it over to any parvenu, Firangi who comes upon asking for it. And he insists and he imprisons her eunuchs, who are the men who administer for her. And he gets into so much trouble in England for this action that he is called back to England and he faces a trial for impeachment for 7 years. So this is the time at which he comes to Nawab Asaf-ud-Daula to apologize, to say, I'm leaving, I'm going back home, I'm very sorry for all the trouble I've caused. Please send a message to your mother, Bahu Begum. So I really like this image because, here it looks like an idyllic picnic happening under the moonlight, but actually a very angry woman behind this who would not let go of her money so easily. And just an image of Warren Hastings, so you can have in your mind the sort of person we are talking about. Bahu Begum was an entirely parda-clad woman, cloistered woman. We have no paintings of her. No Indian artist would have dared to, make something that resembled her. It was said she could not she was not even allowed to let her voice be heard by a man who was not part of the family. And I wanted to just let you know that this year is the year we are celebrating 250 years of Jane Austen's birth. And at exactly this time, she was writing Pride and Prejudice. And for those of you who are fans of Colin Firth, will know that the heroines of Pride and Prejudice, the heroines of all her great novels, are entirely subjugated women. They are women who have no money of their own, even elite women. They cannot control their own money. If their father has no sons, they are entirely disinherited. Their only hope is to find a good husband. Whereas at the same time, Bahu Begum, a parda-clad Muslim woman, had enormous treasure that she could command and had control over, had agency, was ready to fight for, and brought a governor general to his knees. So things are not always what they seem, and I will leave you with that thought for this moment. Thank you so much.
Oh, so that was very interesting, and it's so nice to see all these beautiful paintings being used in a completely different way from how art historians normally approach some of these paintings. But one of the stories I really enjoyed in reading Ira's book is learning more about Bahu Begum. And one thing that we don't always realize is the amount of power she had in Awadh during this time. And I was wondering, maybe you'd like to say a little bit more about that, because when I was reading your book, about the letters that she had written and sent to Warren Hastings, for example, that might be quite...
Yeah, it's absolutely interesting. And a lot of my book actually, I think, deals with that because I found it so fascinating. So what is amazing is that in 1775, Shuja-ud-Daula dies very young, at 45, and Bahu Begum becomes a widow. And at this time, Asaf-ud-Daula decides to go to Lucknow to set up his own capital at Lucknow because his parents had been living at Faizabad. And an extraordinary thing happens here at this time is that there are now two parallel capitals, one run by Bahu Begum and her eunuchs, and the other run by the Nawab, Asaf-ud-Daula. And Asaf-ud-Daula never impinges on her. He never questions her authority. So she has her own administrative units. A lot of them are Khwaja Saras, the elite eunuchs, who are the ones who can, interact with parda-clad women. They run the district according to her wishes. They carry out all her, all the rules and all the regulations that take place under her. And she is able to run her capital according to her wishes. And even passers-by, Europeans who come by the country say that it is very well run. The people were happy. And all that is different with Lucknow, which is run by Asaf-ud-Daula, is that perhaps the ladies wear colors which are slightly more subdued than the very glittering, glitzy colors that are beginning to come out in Lucknow. But she is a woman who will not be browbeaten. So even though she is not allowed to meet face-to-face with European men, she writes to them. Once she is widowed, she feels she has been released from absolutely strict sequestration. So she begins to write letters and writes to the Governor General and sometimes uses terms which are astonishing because she says, I'm a poor, helpless woman. And if ever there was someone who was not poor and helpless, it was Bahu Begum. But you can see that she is trying to manipulate this man who is not responding as an Indian ruler would do and who does not recognize her power for what it is. So she says, listen, I'm just a poor, helpless woman. Do as you will, but give me back my lands, So an extraordinary woman who, outlives all the men that I write about into the early 19th century and is unbeaten till the end, holds on to her power, holds on to her treasure right till the end. And it's a pity that we don't remember that.
And after Asaf-ud-Daula's death, does she have much of a role, or is she influential at that time?
Yes, so it's extremely, it's an extremely volatile time when Asaf-ud-Daula dies. So he has appointed Wazir Ali to be Nawab after him. It is not his child by birth, but he's adopted him very early on and he has taken part in all the ceremonies. So he's an accepted heir. He's not very popular with the British because he confronts them. And eventually they put there is a moment, a transition moment. And during the transition moment, Bahu Begum comes from Faizabad. She installs herself with all her noblemen, with her retinue, with her women in Lucknow, and she starts ruling along with her great Khaja Sara, Almas Ali Khan. And she says to the British, I am perfectly capable of ruling Lucknow. There's no need to put somebody else, or I can be regent for a child if you want to appoint someone. But of course, in the end, the British don't, because they want somebody who is entirely, who recognizes their authority entirely. But she's there. The people recognize her as a ruler, and I think they would have, absolutely accepted her as the ruler after Wazir for sure.
Wow. And so she does shift from Faizabad to Lucknow.
So then finally, she finally shifts because I think there's a moment of great outrage to her dignity, because one of the lesser wives of her husband has the cheek and audacity to ride in a carriage in front of her house, something which she had thought absolutely unacceptable. So she said, this is the last straw, I'm going back home.
Very nice. So I could ask many questions, but I just wanted to turn the questions to the audience, and I see Catherine's hand is already up.
Thank you. Hello, Ira, and thank you for a beautiful book, and also absolutely wonderful to have you here. I'm fascinated by the painting of Hastings sort of apologizing to Bahu Begum.
But that's not what it's titled.
No, of course not. No, it's meeting JeanBaptiste, the son of the Mughal emperor. But what's really fascinating, I've looked at a lot of company paintings, and I think this is the first one I've ever seen that has the English gentleman so prominently not wearing shoes. So you have all of these kind of white stocking legs, including Hastings, and they're sitting on the ground, and Hastings is actually below both the Nawab and JeanBaptiste. Can you tell us a bit more about the painting, because it's fascinating?
It is fascinating. I do like the point about the shoes. I was going to talk about it as well, because I find it fascinating. When the British Europeans began interacting with the Mughals, one of the first things they were told was, take off your shoes when you come into the presence, but not only in the presence, also into a home. Everybody takes off their shoes in India because we know shoes are filthy. The outside is filthy. It's full of all sorts of junk. Take off your shoes. And the British found it absolutely insulting. They would not countenance taking off their shoes, and they made a huge hue and cry about taking off their shoes. Instead, they said, we'll take off our hats. And the Indians were horrified, because you never take off your turban. So they would appear in front of the Mughal emperor, hatless, but with their boots on, which, people must have been staggered by this show of just uncouthness, really. But yes, you are quite right, Catherine. I wonder if they don't have, I'd have to have a look at the real painting. I have a feeling they may have booties on, because this is something that the French, the Comte de Bussy, he had found a very elegant solution to this problem. So he said, okay, as a Frenchman, I cannot take off my shoes, it is true, but I will wear little booties over my shoes. So he carried with him velvet booties, which were not used anywhere else, but when he had to go onto a surface which was carpeted, had a covering, he would slip on these velvet booties. So I have a feeling they're wearing little white booties. I would really be surprised if they were in their stocking toes. But it is a very atmospheric painting, painted, of course, to celebrate the fact that JeanBaptiste, so JeanBaptiste was the son of the Mughal emperor at the time, and he had come looking for help for his father, who was pretty much, under the sway of the Marathas at this time, and he was coming looking for help. And Governor General Hastings was absolutely enamored by this young prince. He was completely taken. If you read his letters at this time to Marion Hastings, his wife, he writes about this prince as, as a romantic, Byronic kind of character. He's completely taken by him. So this painting is meant to, of course, celebrate that. Malini can tell us more about the painting itself, perhaps.
I've actually never seen the painting before, so I was a bit surprised. Because normally you see in portraits of JeanBaptiste as just a single portrait by Isaiah Humphrey, but not that one. So,
no, and I'm trying to figure out, then Malini, you will have to go and have a look. Who is the elite gentleman sitting next to JeanBaptiste? There's a young man. I wonder if it's JeanBaptiste's son, and it has, maybe you will have some thoughts on that.
Yeah.
This is what art historians and writers spend their time doing.
Talking about stockinged feet, there is the very famous portrait of Antoine Polier watching a nautch, and he's sitting on a settee, but he's wearing completely Nawabi clothing, but he kept his socks on while all the dancers and everyone else were barefoot. And I know there's been a hand raised over on this side.
One question from me. Thanks, Ira, for the detailed presentation. My question is more around the title of the book. It's quite intriguing, The Lion and the Lilies. If you can throw some light on it, what's the background? How did you come up with that title?
Yeah, thank you for that. We thought a lot about the title. I wanted to convey a sense of the complexity of the times. And so I was thinking about the banners that everybody was using, the symbolism of various, imagery. And the French, of course, were using, because this is pre-revolution, a lot of this action was happening before 1789. So the banner that the French were fighting under was the French fleur de lis, the lily flower, which was the symbol of the King of France. So when they would go into battle, for example, there was René Madec, I showed you earlier, even when he was fighting with the Jats, his little troop would have the banner of the white fleur de lis. And then you would have the other Mughals and whatever Jat and other sorted pennants. So this lily flower was evocative for the French, and so I wanted to bring out the French connection, which I do try and talk about in the book. And the lion instead is, a lion is very symbolic for a lot of Indian rulers, whether it is the Shias, for whom, Imam Ali is very closely symbolized as a lion, lion of God. So that is powerful for them. Even Tipu Sultan, who has a walk-on role in my book, had the symbol of the sher, tiger. So for a lot of Indian rulers, the lion was an important symbol, so I thought I would juxtapose the two.
And you also do get the lion on the capitals of Claude Martin's Constantia.
Yeah. In fact, his earlier Farhad Baksh, as we know today, was actually Château de Lyon, which is a play on the word lion, lion in French.
Very nice.
I just wanted to ask you, along this journey, if you had discovered much about the sepoys?
About the Sipahis? Anything in particular?
Well, I think I'm really interested in their world and what they, how they had this, because I think this loyalty, which the people at the top didn't seem to have.
Yeah, they certainly didn't. You're absolutely right. So the Sipahis were often farmer warriors. They were often just agricultural men from the countryside in times of famine, in times of want, who then took to, fighting for whoever would pay for them. And in the end, the East India Company ended up being the best paymaster, really. One of the great strengths that they had was that they would pay on time, whereas the Indian system often was, we are going to battle, if we win the battle, you can plunder the train, the retinue, the treasure that the other army is carrying, and get your salary from there. So it was, a system which could be very difficult for ordinary people to live with. So one of the great things that the East India Company had was a regular salary, and they were good paymasters. But a lot of these men were simple village people, agriculturalists, which is why we see in 1857, people often assume it was a great shock at 1857 when there was the uprising, when there was the first war of independence. But the fact is that there were uprisings, there was unhappiness, there were battles throughout. That is something, I couldn't talk about everything today. It is something I bring about in the book, is that there was a lot of pushback from the beginning because the East India Company was an extractive system. It took out money to send back to England. That was the basis, of how they operated, which in turn, and they changed agricultural policies, and land was taken away from the original owners. So there was a lot of unhappiness. There was a lot of famine. So the reason that 1857 happens in this spectacular way, especially with Awadh, is that a lot of these farmer warriors had seen famine from way back, had understood that under the East India Company, there was a lot of unhappiness and a lot of extractive violence, which meant that there were regular famines happening, droughts and famines happening. So it was a system ripe to explode in violence because these warriors, these sipahis were actually at heart farmers and still had deep roots and connections with the land.
Great. And now we just have one last question, and then we're going to have to wrap up. So.
Hi, Ira. I think one of the most compelling classes of people in the book are the eunuchs in the court. And they're not at all the disempowered people that cliche would present them as. They've actually got agency and they've got lots of influence and wealth. Can you tell us a little bit about this set of characters and their backgrounds and their stories?
Thank you, Manu. Manu has had to do many such sessions with me, so he knows what questions to ask. So the eunuchs were a very interesting set of characters for me as well. And as Manu says, we think of eunuchs, when we talk of eunuchs, we think of feminized, characters, a little bit like, who is that person in Game of Thrones? The spider character? Right. But these men, when they are talked about by local writers, they are in fact spoken of as being very manly, very upright, very well-built, by dressing very soberly but very well, by having a lot of standing in the community. And these are men who are as educated as they can get, whatever is possible. They attract educated men around themselves. They have a mini court around themselves in Faizabad when under Bahu Begum and Nawab Begum especially. And so it was a real revelation for me to learn about these men, and they are carrying out the orders of the Begums. So these are the most powerful women of the time, and when the Nawabs are not there, they are the most powerful people, period. So they have to symbolize that woman's dignity. So they themselves have to be very dignified and have to have a large retinue around them. So they are very successful in the jobs they do right up to the time in which they come into contact with the British, the Europeans, because the Europeans and the British in particular do not understand this. They see the eunuchs and they think, these should be androgynous kind of men, effeminate men. They are an assault on their own ideas of manhood and dignity. And they start to put them aside in whatever way they can. They write about them in really derogatory terms, and little by little the power of the great eunuchs fritters away. But till the early 19th century, they were big power players along with the Begums, the Nawabs, and the British.
Well, thank you so much. And if you haven't read Ira's book, I recommend it.
You really should.
And I think we're going to end here, but I believe there's a book signing afterwards, so please join Ira for her book signing.
Thank you, Malini. Thank you for taking the time.